A new book coming out in October from Harvard Business called WTF, What's the Future and Why It's Up to Us. And I'm here at the Aspen Institute, and I'm doing a conversation tomorrow about the book with Charles. But I just went to this incredible talk by Charles about his book, The Power of Habit. And if I had actually read his book before I wrote mine, I would have probably changed what I wrote in it because so much of it is relevant. And I kind of want to have this conversation where we talk about your book and mine, and how we can do a mind meld.
Let's do it. And I love that it's WTF, what's the future? Because when we say WTF in my household, that's not what it means. But no, that's a much better, much better question.
I will say that the way I open the book is there's all this technology that makes us say WTF. And that WTF can be the WTF of amazement, or it can be the WTF of disgust and dismay. And in our economy, we see both of those things. And the book is really about how do we think about what's going on with technology in the economy today so that we can have it give us and deliver to us the WTF of amazement and not that WTF of dismay.
And what's interesting is, when I was writing my last book, Smarter, Faster, Better, I did a bunch of research about economic revolutions, what it's like to live through an economic revolution, because we're living through one right now. That's why you wrote WTF, is we're living through this uncertain time. And I read all these diaries from people who lived through the Industrial Revolution, the Agrarian Revolution, like they're in the heart of it. They were all anxious. Like, it didn't matter if you were rich, the 1%. It didn't matter if you were a farmer. Everyone was just anxious all the time about what is going on. WTF, like, why? How do I prepare for the future? And so this anxiety that we feel right now, this is the characteristic of an economic revolution.
And that leads me perfectly into your conversation about habits, because you were talking as one of your examples about why do people chew their nails.
Right.
And maybe talk a little bit about that, and then apply that to the current dismay and what's happening in politics.
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's playing out totally.
No, I think you're exactly right. That's a really good analogy. I hadn't thought about it until you just mentioned it.
Trump is chewing our nails about our anxiety.
So,
there's
this question. So every habit has a cue and a routine and a reward. And there's been this question for years, what is the reward when people bite their nails? Why do people bite their nails? What they found out is that the cue is usually anxiety or boredom. Something just creates tension in your brain. And people bite their nails because if you're a nail biter, and anyone watching knows this, when you get down to your nail, it actually hurts a little bit, right? Like, it gets sore because you're biting into the quick. And that sense of pain, it actually happens in the same part of our brain as tension. And pain actually will overwhelm tension. It'll push tension out. So your brain actually prefers pain to tension. It prefers it so much that it makes pain into a reward that gets you to bite your nails. And I hadn't thought about the analogy until you just made it. But you're right. During this period, we will do crazy things to relieve the tension of living in an economic revolution, like electing people or whom we might not otherwise, necessarily like.
Right.
But they relieve that tension. And like, the human brain will do almost anything to relieve tension.
There's also this element that came to me when I was listening to you talk, which is that part of what you have to do is become aware of the source of this action that you're taking. And then you have to actually substitute a new action. And it seems to me that is something we need to do on a societal level. We have to become aware. And again, that's what I'm trying to do in the book, kind of create some frames whereby we see things about our economy and about how we're using technology in our economy, and then ask ourselves, what could we do differently?
Yeah.
And that seemed to be, again, part of your recipe for changing a habit.
Well, and what I liked about, because I got a copy of the book in preparation for our talk tomorrow, and also just because I like your writing. And what I really liked about it was that it poses this question of what choices should we make about the technology we use, right? And so I have a question for you on this, because I think you have grown, you have spent most of your life as kind of emblematic of the technology industry and a pillar of it. Have people always realized that we need to make, in Silicon Valley, have people realized that we need to make choices about technology, or is that a new awareness? Was it previously like, if you can build it, do it because it's amazing, or have people been making choices the whole time? Have they been conscious of those choices?
I think for too long, the technology industry has thought of itself as the underdog. We're kind of we're the disruptors. We're the people who are on the fringes, who are trying. We're the revolutionaries trying to make change happen. And I think the big difference is that tech has become so dominant, and it's really at the point where it's an underlying layer of everything. And I think we just haven't grown into our responsibility as an industry yet.
Well, and let's talk about Uber, because Uber is a perfect example, I think, of that, right? That Uber saw itself as an underdog. It saw itself as a company that always had to fight and be scrappy to stay alive. It built a culture that justified a great number of things because...
That's right. Well, and they're right, because in fact there is a lot of competition. There is a lot of risk to their business. But here's the thing. We have an economy in which the rewards that we have created for certain kinds of business activity are so large that it encourages bad behavior. We saw this with Wall Street. Now, the fact is, why do we think that's okay? That effectively we're saying, hey, you know what? If you, are really shitty, you can actually make so goddamn much money that it's worth, holding your nose. You think about what happened in Wall Street, where they were creating products that didn't really work, selling them to unsuspecting customers, risking the entire world economy. And, we actually have tech companies that have those same incentives. It's like, this is it's like if you built just look at the difference between Lyft and Uber. Lyft is actually just as world-changing as Uber, but they're not as aggressive.
Right.
And they're valued at $5 billion, which is still like a boatload of money.
It's a good amount of money.
But, Uber's valued at 60 because they're more aggressive. They can go faster, go harder. And, do we actually, is that the economy that we need? And one of the things that I do in the book is I really try to build this idea of how networks and algorithms are shaping our society. And algorithms have this master fitness function. Google with relevance of search results or ads, and Facebook with engagement. And, like we saw with fake news, that engagement algorithm is going wrong, and Mark is working really hard to fix it and figure out, no, that wasn't what we meant.
Right.
Right? There's this great quote about computer programming, debugging, that I learned early in my career. This guy, Andrew Singer, once said to me, the art of debugging is figuring out what you really told the computer to do instead of what you thought you told the computer to do. And I think, we are now in the throes of this vast machine that we're building. Our economy is increasingly a machine.
And it has
and we are not thinking through what we told it to do.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah. And let's go to some questions, because feel free to send in questions, by the way, or type questions on Facebook. Doreen Mendoza, Doreen, it's nice to we haven't met before, but I'm sure you're a very pleasant person. You said, since you're at the Ideas Festival, what's your big idea? And this is actually a great question, I think, because what is the big idea? I mean, I think there is a search now for big ideas like there's never been before. And I would say, and I think this gets into WTF, for me the big idea is marketplaces have been amazing, right? Marketplaces have created more wealth and alleviated more poverty than any other thing that we have been able to find throughout history. And right now we are trying to figure out, how do we make marketplaces that have the fitness for the goals that we want? Because a marketplace run amok will default to certain goals. It'll default to wealth creation for the 1%. It'll default to shareholder value instead of creating good lives for employees. How do we create marketplaces, whether we're governments, whether we're societies, whether we're individuals, whether we're schools? How do we rein in these marketplaces so that they serve the goals that we're choosing rather than the goals that just emerge? Because the brilliance of marketplaces is that they do allow things to emerge. They're efficient that way.
Charles has totally internalized the message of my book. I couldn't have said it better myself. But what I would say my big idea is that when we want to frame the power of technology, it's to empower people to do things that were previously impossible. When we went through that first industrial revolution, there was that famous Luddite rebellion, those weavers smashing looms. They couldn't imagine that their children, rather their great children and great grandchildren would have more clothes than the kings and queens of Europe.
Yeah.
They couldn't imagine that we would dig a tunnel between England and France. They couldn't imagine we'd go to the moon. What are we not imagining? You know, there's this incredible cornucopia of things that we could be doing with AI, and all we're saying is we're worried it's going to put people out of work. Well, the only reason it's going to put people out of work is because the owners of those machines are saying, well, let's just roll in the chips and not keep upping the ante. We got to keep. So to me, I want an economy where we're saying, okay, let's use this technology, make the world a better place for everyone.
So Brian Neighbors asks, what's the best advice you have received and why? Tim, what's the best advice you've received and why?
That's a tough one. There's so much good advice.
I've got one. I got one while you're thinking on that. Actually, two. The best advice, honestly, that I ever got was marry someone you like you just get along with, and then don't get divorced. It's super expensive. It's really inefficient, and it's worked out pretty well for me because, like, I met my wife when I was in college, and I'm 42 now, so it's been a little while. It kind of works out. But the other good piece of advice is, I think that, so Silicon Valley in particular, but everyone kind of fetishizes learning from failure, right? Everyone will say, I fail so well. People will brag about how well they fail, which is basically kind of BS, right? If you're like, I fail better than anyone else fails, you're not really failing in that case. But I think the thing is, how do you learn from failure?
Yeah.
And the answer is, you got to get at peace with seeing your choices as experiments. Because you shouldn't try and seek failure. If you fail, you shouldn't be like, thank God I failed, because I learned so much from it. Failure should hurt a little bit. But when you see all of your choices as experiments, it means that when you fail, it's a piece of data that you can learn from, and it doesn't hurt so bad. And that's what I think ends up screwing us up, is when we let failure hurt so bad that we start to shy away from it, or we start to pretend like we failed when we haven't, or we brag about how good we are at failing. Somehow to capture the emotions and wall off the emotions of failure, that's the thing that lets you learn from it in a real way.
Good. All right, I've now actually come back to this great piece of advice I received. This is, I just graduated from college with a degree in classics. And a friend had asked me if I would write a book about science fiction writer Frank Herbert, because he knew I was a big science fiction fan. And I was worried. And he said, look, you're 21 years old. You don't have to worry about what you're going to do with your life. If you haven't figured it out by the time you're 30, maybe start to worry. And it was just this encouragement, follow your nose. And I did. I wrote the book, and that convinced me that I was a writer. And then I had a friend who was a programmer who got asked to write a manual, and I said it'd help him out. And that led me into a tech writing business, which then led me to a publishing business, which led me to do what I do. And I've given that advice to many people over the years, but it seems very relevant today because the era of the single career, the single job is over, and we do have to keep reinventing ourselves.
Yeah.
And so maybe the answer isn't, if you haven't figured out what you're doing by the time you're 30, you might worry. Maybe the answer is, if you haven't figured out what you're doing by the time you're 80, it's like keep changing.
Yeah.
It's that great line from Nietzsche, you must change to stay with me.
Yeah. So there's another question. So Erin Murray Manning writes, besides WTF, what should be on our summer reading list? So first of all, WTF.
Power of Habit.
Power of Habit and WTF. But besides those, what have you read recently that you really liked?
I love Sapiens by Yuval Noah Harari. I haven't read his new book, Homo Deus, but Sapiens, start there. It's basically a wonderful book that retraces all of human history and talks about how cooperation is all beyond a small band, beyond Dunbar's number effectively, is all based on fictions that we subscribe to collectively. It's a brilliant, it's a tour de force. And of course it fits, people have said this before, I've always loved Wallace Stevens, the poet, who talked about how the search for reality is the search actually for supreme fiction. There are aesthetic visions that we share with each other, and that we buy in, that we invent this world that we live in together. Science does that. We have a new consensus about what's true. And when we don't have the right consensus about what's true, we can't act. And we see that today with issues like climate change. And so, this so interesting thing about storytelling and
no, I think that's in fact what I was going to recommend was I mostly read fiction, to be honest, and so there's a book called The Brothers Sisters that I just like, that I love. It's just a fantastic book. It's like a new take on a Western. But the reason I like it is for exactly the reason you just mentioned, which is everything is about our ability to tell stories. Right? And storytelling is really hard. A story has to be surprising. It has to be surprising in a surprising way. It has to somehow touch a universal experience, but at the same time be so rooted in something that's specific. Stories are actually really, really hard to find and tell. And I think the books I love the most are the ones that almost are a masterclass in here's how to tell a story. The other book that is actually, I think, one of the best books of the last 100 years is A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which is just amazing, won the Pulitzer Prize. And it is this master class in storytelling. Because I think if you're in Silicon Valley, if you're in politics, if you're an advocate for something, you succeed if you tell a better story. And that's really hard.
That's great. Wow. Valerie Weideman Mattingly-Dinelin says, I'm a school teacher. If you were to come speak to my class, what would you say?
Say, listen to your teacher.
No, I think I would say what I already said now that I think about it, which is just follow your nose, trust yourself, and find things that you really care about. There's this great line I totally love. This is actually one of my books. One of the books of my life is Witterbinder's translation of Lao Tzu. And it has this wonderful line, caring is the giant shield from heaven against being dead. And so find the things that you care about and go for it. And that's the economy of the future is an economy in which, let's just imagine that the robots do everything. What will the human economy be? It will be about caring. It will be about caring for each other. It will be about creating things. And when I talk about creating, I think about the creative economy writ large. There's a wonderful book called Air Guitar by an art critic named Dave Hickey. And in it, there's an essay called The Birth of the Big Beautiful Art Market. And it's about how after World War II, General Motors sort of soaked up the productivity that was now, no longer needed for the war by creating the car as an art object. And Dave Hickey refers to an art market as one in which a product is sold on the basis of what it means, not what it does. And so you think about how we have all these commodities and we differentiate them by adding in ideas. This isn't just coffee, it's single origin coffee.
Right.
It's organic, it's fair trade. That's a substance plus an idea. And you think about restaurants. When I was a kid growing up, there was a Chinese restaurant, an Italian restaurant, and that was about it, in every city. And now you think about the hundreds of ethnic restaurants and people competing. That's the economy of the future. And
I think that's right.
And so the platforms, the great platforms of the world, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Amazons, the Ubers, they actually should be thinking, how do I support that economy? And Facebook, I think, is doing a great job. When I think about people who are creating on Facebook, now Facebook has to actually think about, okay, how do we actually make sure that that's a real economy for those people and not just although there are definitely other ways to, for money to circulate. But money has to circulate or the whole economy fails.
So there's a good question. Justin Pointier, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name right, says, looking back, what would you tell your 20-year-old self today? Which is a great question, actually. You know what I would tell my 20-year-old self is, and it plays off of what you were just saying, and I think what WTF is about. It's okay to succeed slowly. Yes. It's actually better to succeed slowly. I think when I was 20 years old, I was really focused on trying to prove that to myself that I was going to be a success or I was going to succeed. And so I was eager to find things I could succeed at. But now when I look around, the people who are just knocking it out of the park, they're people who didn't succeed for 10, 15 years. But they focused on this thing that they cared about, that they were obsessive about. Mm-hmm. They got so good at it that when they finally did succeed, they were untouchable. Right? Nobody could approach them. So I think that if you're 20 years ago, I would have been 22. I would have told myself, like, just don't try and succeed before you're 35 or 33 or whatever it is. Because the slower you succeed, the longer you're going to be able to ride that wave.
That's very interesting. And of course, Silicon Valley is all about trying to succeed as quickly as possible and flip it and move on. And I've had the same company. I basically started my company a couple of years out of college. I've been doing it for 40 years, and long, slow success. So I definitely appreciate that. So do we want to take one more question?
Last question? Go for it.
What do we have here?
Should we do this one from Andrew J. O'Keefe?
Sure.
How can the average non-techie, Andrew J. O'Keefe II, how can the average non-techie, economically famished person help contribute towards building a better world for the largest number of people? You take that one.
Yeah, well, let me just start by saying the fact that you're asking that question and caring about it is the biggest first step, because trying to create a world where you create more value than you capture for yourself is actually the beginning of a robust economy. There's this great line from Robert Putnam, the famous sociologist and political scientist. He studied, early in his career, he studied wealthy cities and poor cities in a particular region of Italy. And he found that the rich cities were civic. But when he studied, he said they were not civic because they were rich. They had become rich because they were civic.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so working for other people to make the world around you better actually is the best way. And that's one of the reasons I'm so involved in a nonprofit called Code for America. We're trying to fix government, because government is collective action. It's how do we actually make this world a better place, and working in your city. And I think about this really practically even. Like if you don't have a job, go volunteer. Don't sit on the couch. Don't just look for a job. Go make something better. And I bet you will find that you will fall into something. If I didn't have a job, I'd go out and start cleaning up my neighborhood.
I don't think I can do better than that. That's pretty good. Except to say, go buy more books. Buy WTF.
And by the power of habit. It's awesome. I mean, I think the message that Charles has is life-changing, applied psychology, applied neuroscience that you can use to make your life better every day.
Thank you for joining us today. This is a lot of fun.
Yeah, thank you.